Sheldon Cooper did not walk in on his father cheating. He walked in on his mother. But somehow, a blonde wig, a fake German accent, and one unanswered question were enough to convict George Cooper for the rest of his life. That sounds impossible until you compare what Sheldon claimed happened in The Big Bang Theory with what young Sheldon finally showed us. Because those two scenes do not merely contain different details, they tell two different stories. And Mary Cooper is standing at the center of the gap between them. Not because she pulled Sheldon aside and ordered him to keep quiet. The show never gives us that scene. Mary probably never even realized Sheldon had seen anything. What she did was quieter. She helped create a family where uncomfortable questions were buried, sex was wrapped in shame, George was already treated like the morally suspicious parent, and Sheldon learned that whatever happened behind a closed bedroom door was not something you discussed. So he never asked. George never explained. Mary never corrected him. Then George died, and the wrong version became permanent. The scene that changes everything happens in Young Sheldon, Season 7, Episode 4. Sheldon has returned from Germany. He approaches his parents' bedroom and hears a woman inside. Her voice sounds exaggerated, foreign, playful. Then she asks George, "Are you sure your wife won't come home?" Sheldon knocks once. He opens the door. George is in bed with a blonde woman wearing German braids. Sheldon freezes. Then he runs. The episode plays the reveal as a brutal joke because the woman is not Brenda Sparks. It is not some stranger George dragged home. It is Mary, wearing a wig and pretending to be Helga while she and George experiment with roleplay. The audience knows. George knows. Mary knows. Sheldon is the only person in the room who has no idea what he just saw. Now strip away the comedy. Forget the wig. Forget George shouting Mary's fake name. Look at the scene through Sheldon's eyes. He has already heard years of fighting. He has watched his parents sleep in separate rooms. He knows Brenda Sparks has been circling his father. He knows Pastor Rob has been circling his mother. He has heard Mary speak about drinking, temptation, sin, marriage, and adultery, as if one moral mistake can destroy a family. Then he opens the door and sees what appears to be proof. A woman who is not his mother. His father with his clothes off. The door slamming shut inside Sheldon's head. And what does Sheldon do next? Nothing. That is the part people keep skipping. He does not confront George. He does not tell Mary. He does not ask Missy what Mary was wearing that afternoon. He does not even stand outside long enough to hear Mary speak in her normal voice. He runs out of the house carrying an image that he has already decided he understands. Years later, adult Sheldon explains that this moment caused his 3-knock ritual. 1 knock announces his presence. The second and third give the people inside enough time to put their pants back on. Funny. Quirky. Classic Sheldon. Except it is not a harmless quirk. It is a trauma response built around the wrong woman. And The Big Bang Theory makes the mistake even worse. In Season 10, Episode 5, Sheldon tells Penny that the incident happened when he was 13. He says he came home early during spring break. He says Mary was away at Bible study. He heard sounds coming from the bedroom, opened the door, and saw George with another woman. Sheldon claims he and George locked eyes. Then Sheldon says he ran to his own bedroom. Neither of them ever spoke about it again. That account is the foundation of one of the most emotionally revealing scenes The Big Bang Theory ever gave Sheldon. He is not merely explaining his knocking, he is admitting that he is terrified he will betray Amy the way he believes George betrayed Mary. But almost every major detail is wrong. Young Sheldon does not show Mary at Bible study. She is in the bedroom. It does not happen during spring break from college. Sheldon has just returned from Germany. He does not run to his room. He runs out the front door. The scene does not clearly show George and Sheldon holding some long, devastating eye contact. And the other woman is not another woman. She is Mary. So where did the extra details come from? Because Sheldon is not normally vague. This is the same man who can remember the layout of a train station, the wording of a roommate agreement, and what someone served him for dinner 15 years earlier. Yet the biggest accusation he ever made against his father is stitched together with details the prequel says never happened. That is not a continuity error you shrug off. That is the entire point. Young Sheldon's producers later confirmed that Sheldon still believes George cheated. He never recognized Mary beneath the wig and the roleplay. Producer Steve Holland described Sheldon as sincere but not in possession of all the facts. George did not have a physical affair. Sheldon simply died believing that he did. And there is a psychological term for what happened here. A source monitoring error. That is when the memory itself survives, but the brain assigns the wrong origin to it. You remember the image. You remember the emotion. You remember the conclusion. But you become confused about which parts you witnessed, which parts you assumed, and which parts were added later by stories that seem to fit. Sheldon remembers the blonde wig. He remembers George. He remembers the bedroom. But his brain labels the woman as a stranger because "my mother dressed as a German barmaid" is not a possibility he can imagine. Once that label is attached, the entire memory reorganizes itself. Mary must have been at Bible study. George must have seen him. Sheldon must have run to his bedroom. George's drinking must have led to adultery. The story becomes smoother every time he remembers it. But smoother does not mean truer. And that should let Mary off the hook. She did not know Sheldon was outside. She did not know he opened the door. She did not tell him the blonde woman was real. Except Mary's role in this started years before that bedroom scene. The most important line in this entire family does not come from Sheldon. It comes from George. Young Sheldon, Season 4, Episode 18. Missy is devastated over Marcus. The house explodes. George and Mary begin arguing. But this fight is different. George stops defending one mistake and starts describing his entire life. He says he is stuck coaching high school football. He lives across the street from Mary's mother. He is constantly criticized by the people he supports. Mary responds with sarcasm. She says she did not realize he was so unhappy. George looks at her and says, "Because you never bother to ask." Then he walks out. He goes to the bar. Brenda Sparks sits beside him. The episode ends before we know how far the conversation will go. That line is not only about Mary and George. It is the Cooper family's operating system. Nobody asks. Mary does not ask George why he is miserable until he is already walking out. George does not ask Mary why she is emotionally drifting toward Pastor Rob. Missy notices everything, but the adults dismiss her as dramatic. Georgie gets Mandy pregnant and tries to solve the crisis through action, because emotional honesty has never worked in that house. Then Sheldon sees the most confusing thing he has ever witnessed. He does exactly what his family taught him. He does not ask. The audience watched George walk into a bar and assumed he was about to become the man adult Sheldon described. Then young Sheldon did something much crueler. It made George hesitate. Season 5 gives George and Brenda every opportunity to cross the line. They share emotional intimacy. They hide conversations. They recognize something in each other that neither is getting at home. But the show repeatedly pulls them back before the physical affair Sheldon later describes. Lance Barber called it a crime of the heart, emotional betrayal, dangerous closeness, but not the bedroom affair Sheldon swore happened. And while George is drifting toward Brenda, Mary is not standing in spotless moral innocence. She is dreaming about Pastor Rob, avoiding him because the attraction makes her uncomfortable, then finding reasons to be around him anyway. In Season 5, Episode 6, Mary and Pastor Rob supervise a church lock-in. They slip away and smoke confiscated cigarettes together while George, suspicious and lonely, sees them looking far more intimate than Mary would ever admit. At nearly the same moment, George considers calling Brenda. Both parents are staring over the edge. Only one of them will eventually be remembered as the monster. That is where Mary's influence becomes ugly. Not conspiratorial. Ugly. Mary defines morality inside that house. She decides which mistakes are temptations, which mistakes are sins, and which mistakes become someone's entire identity. When Mary feels desire toward Pastor Rob, she treats it as a spiritual struggle. She prays, she feels guilty, she tells herself she is trying to do the right thing. When George drinks, complains, or spends time with Brenda, those actions become evidence of who he is. Weak, selfish, unreliable. The problem is not that George is innocent. He is not. The problem is that Mary's flaws are described as battles she is fighting, while George's flaws are described as the man he has chosen to become. And Sheldon grows up inside that language. That does not mean Mary sat down and told him, "Your father slept with another woman." The show never proves that. But she does not need to plant the story directly. Sheldon already has the image. Mary's version of George gives that image somewhere to live. This is the second source monitoring error. The bedroom memory comes from Sheldon. The moral interpretation comes from the household. Years later, the two feel like one event. That is why Sheldon can recount the supposed affair with complete confidence, even though the evidence inside his own memory does not survive comparison with what happened. He is not lying. He is repeating a verdict. And the one person who could have appealed it never knew there had been a trial. George Cooper dies without discovering that Sheldon thinks he cheated. Sit with that. George knows Sheldon walked in. He probably knows Sheldon saw something embarrassing. But from George's perspective, Sheldon saw his married parents having sex. Awkward, yes. Mortifying, absolutely. But not a betrayal requiring some emergency confession. George has no reason to chase Sheldon down and announce that the blonde woman was Mary because he assumes his genius son recognized his own mother. Why would he not? Her face is still her face. Her voice is still her voice beneath the accent. She is in her own bedroom. George assumes Sheldon understands. Sheldon assumes George knows he has been exposed. Both men interpret the silence as mutual understanding. They are not sharing the same secret. They are sharing two completely different secrets while believing the other person knows. That is not a sitcom misunderstanding. That is a time bomb. And George dies before it can explode. Subscribe, because we are opening more files on this family, and apparently every joke came with a body buried underneath it. The person who comes closest to exposing what is really happening is not Sheldon. It is Missy. Season 6, Episode 14. Mandy is going into labor. Everyone is rushing toward the hospital. George arrives with Brenda. Mary arrives with Pastor Rob. Then the four adults see one another. George sees Mary with the man she insists is merely her pastor. Mary sees George with the woman she insists is merely their neighbor. Nobody says the truth out loud because the truth would force everyone to admit they have been doing the same thing, wanting to be seen by somebody outside the marriage. Mary confronts Brenda. Missy has already noticed that Brenda has a secret man. But Missy has also noticed Mary and Pastor Rob. The adults think the children are protected because the affair is emotional rather than physical. Missy knows better. She has been watching the entire house divide itself into secrets. Sheldon watches facts. Missy watches people. That difference matters. Sheldon can tell you what time somebody entered a room. Missy can tell you why they did not want to go home. Sheldon sees Brenda near George and files it as suspicious evidence. Missy sees the way George changes around Brenda. Sheldon sees Pastor Rob at church. Missy sees the way Mary changes around Pastor Rob. Sheldon's intelligence makes him look like the best witness. Emotionally, he may be the worst witness in the entire family, because he can replay what he saw with perfect visual precision while completely misunderstanding what it meant. The Big Bang Theory warned us about this years before young Sheldon existed. Season 3, Episode 7. Leonard and Penny are fighting. Their argument becomes so uncomfortable that Sheldon begins reenacting his parents' battles from childhood. His voice changes. He plays Mary threatening to leave if George does not stop drinking. Then he plays George mocking the threat because Mary is still there while he is already drunk. Then Mary tells George to stop because Sheldon is crying. The scene is performed for comedy. Strip the laughter away. Adult Sheldon is not making up random characters. He is playing both parents from memory. He has memorized the rhythm of the fights, the accusations, the threats, the drinking. The moment his own fear became another weapon they threw at one another. He does not remember a marriage. He remembers prosecution and defense. Mary makes the accusation. George fires back. Sheldon sits in the middle, collecting evidence. So when he opens that bedroom door years earlier and sees a blonde woman beside George, which parent's argument does the image support? Mary's. The drinking husband. The disappointing husband. the man who might ruin everything. The bedroom does not create Sheldon's opinion of George. It appears to confirm the opinion already waiting inside him. And once George dies, there is nobody left to contradict it. That is where grief does something vicious. When somebody dies, the living do not preserve a complete person. They preserve the version that helps them survive. Missy remembers the father who taught her baseball, understood her anger, and could sit beside her without demanding that she become Sheldon. Georgie remembers the man whose responsibilities suddenly landed on his shoulders. Mary remembers the husband she loved, resented, depended on, fought with, and never expected to lose so quickly. Sheldon remembers a collection of moments that fit inside stories. The football coach, the drinker, the man who did not understand science, the father who cheated. Simple labels for a complicated man. Then the Big Bang Theory turns those labels into punchlines. Sheldon remembers George teaching him archery, but the memory is tied to alcohol. He borrows George's football conversation when he tries to understand Leonard. He repeats crude things George supposedly taught him about women. When Bernadette's father offers him beer in Season 7, Episode 9, Sheldon initially resists because Mary never allowed George to give him one at graduation. Then Sheldon drinks. For a few seconds, the mockery disappears. He raises the bottle and remembers his father. That is the father leaking through the caricature. Sheldon claims George was ignorant, but he copies him. He claims George embarrassed him, but he imitates him. He claims George was simply a drunk, but the offer of one beer becomes a moment of connection Sheldon still remembers decades later. The son who says he wants nothing to do with his father has carried George's language into every room he enters. But he also carries the false affair. That is what makes the retcon so brutal. Young Sheldon does not erase the Big Bang Theory. It explains how the Big Bang Theory's Sheldon could be completely sincere and completely wrong. The prequel is not an objective correction delivered to Sheldon. It is a correction delivered to us. We know George did not cheat. Sheldon does not. We watch him defend a wound that was never inflicted. We watch him fear becoming a man his father never actually became. We watch him design a 3-knock ritual to prevent other people from repeating a crime that did not happen. Then we laugh because he says penny 3 times. That laugh sounds different now. Every knock is a flashback. Every pause is Sheldon giving imaginary adulterers the time he wishes George had taken to hide the evidence. Every closed door is the Cooper bedroom. Every woman who answers is a blonde stranger who was actually his mother. And Mary never corrects the story because she never hears the question. But that still does not remove her from it. After George dies in Young Sheldon, Season 7, Episode 13, Mary is shattered. Not gracefully. Not quietly. She is furious that George left her. She stands at his funeral, carrying love and rage in the same body. She has lost the person she fought with, relied on, blamed, forgave, and planned to grow old beside. Mary's grief is not hypocrisy. It is proof that the marriage was always more complicated than Sheldon's later summaries allowed. She loved George. She also helped reduce him. Those things can coexist. And after the funeral, the family starts moving toward the versions we meet in the Big Bang Theory. Mary moves deeper into religion. Missy rebels. Georgie becomes the person who keeps the family functioning. Sheldon leaves Texas. The man they all revolved around is gone. Now think about what happens to stories inside a family after the only person who could dispute them is dead. They harden. George cannot explain Brenda. He cannot describe the loneliness behind the bar conversation. He cannot ask Mary about Pastor Rob. He cannot tell Sheldon that Helga was his mother. He cannot say, "You did not see what you think you saw." Mary becomes the surviving narrator. Not because she deliberately rewrites George into a villain, because grief gives the survivor the final word even when the survivor is not speaking. Every complaint Mary ever made now has no answer. Every flaw Sheldon remembers now has no context. Every joke about George's drinking lands without George being present to fire one back. Silence does the rewriting for them. And that brings us to the third source monitoring error. Adult Sheldon does not know where his memory of George ends and Mary's interpretation of George begins. He treats the mixture as an exact recording. That is why the contradiction does not disturb him. He cannot see it. The wrong source is built into the memory. But young Sheldon gives us one final weapon against Sheldon's certainty. The finale reveals that the entire story has been framed through adult Sheldon writing his memoir. Amy challenges him when his version becomes too self-centered. She forces him to consider what his children need, what his family sacrificed, and whether the story he tells about himself is the whole story. It is not. It never was. The narrator has always been revising his past while pretending he is merely recording it. That means every contradiction between the Big Bang Theory and young Sheldon is not automatically a mistake. Some are evidence. Adult Sheldon remembers himself as the center of every room. Young Sheldon repeatedly shows Missy being ignored. Adult Sheldon remembers George as a failure. Young Sheldon shows George surrendering opportunities, money, pride, and peace to keep the family together. Adult Sheldon remembers catching George with another woman. Young Sheldon shows his mother beneath the wig. The entire prequel is Sheldon learning, too late and without realizing it, that memory is not the same thing as truth. But there is one memory he cannot revise, not because it is accurate, because the person he needs is dead. After George's death, Sheldon repeatedly imagines ways their final interaction might have gone differently. He imagines saying goodbye. He imagines hugging him. He imagines giving George the kind of final moment that real life denied them. But Sheldon never imagines asking about the bedroom. Why would he? In his mind, that question has already been answered. That is the final cruelty. Sheldon can rewrite the goodbye because he knows it was incomplete. He cannot rewrite the accusation because he thinks it is complete. George loses the chance to defend himself precisely because Sheldon is too certain to ask. Mary did not need to lock the truth away. Sheldon locked it himself. Mary supplied the moral vocabulary. The family supplied the silence. George supplied the embarrassment. The wig supplied the stranger. Then Sheldon's memory turned all four into a confession nobody ever made.